Good morning and welcome to our Zoom with the Fort Langley National Historic Site. Ammon is coming to us from the storeroom at the fort. So Ammon, take it away.
Good morning. Ammon from Fort Langley National Historic Site. Right now I'm in the only original building of the fort, the Storehouse. This building is so old, it's 27 years older than Canada. And if you've ever played with Lincoln logs, that's exactly how this building is put together. So it's like an old-fashioned version of Legos. So these beams right above my head, each one weighs well over 1,000 pounds, and there's no nails keeping it up. It's just gravity and perfectly put together, cut out tongue and groove shapes, so they just fit into their slots perfectly. But if we needed to take it apart, we could take it apart like an old Lego set and move the whole building. And that's actually how they moved Fort Langley when Fort Langley was 12 years old in 1839. They realized they built Fort Langley too close to the Fraser River, so they had to take it apart, move it on top of a hill. So in 1839, they took apart the whole fort and they moved it. But then that fort burned down. So then they had to rebuild. And when they rebuilt the fort, this was one of the first buildings that they rebuilt. But as you look around, we can see we've added a few things. We've added some lights. We've added a fire extinguisher system, which is actually foam. So in case there is a fire, this whole building would fill up with foam and put out the fire. So that way we don't damage the wood. But the way the building is displayed, we have it to show the use of all four buildings that would have been on this side, the east side of Fort Langley. And they would have been like warehouses. But back then we'd call them all storehouses. And not all of them would be holding all the goods that I'm about to show you in this building. Each one would specialize in different goods. One building might have the trade items that our customers would want. Popular items would commonly be things like metal goods, trinkets you could always have, possible buttons, beads, bells, fabric. People would think muskets were popular. Surprisingly, guns weren't that popular in Fort Langley, mainly because most of our customers were fishermen, and they didn't have too many enemies here either. And the third reason, the weather here is pretty bad. It's wet most of the time, and the black powder you need to shoot these muskets, it's called hydroscopic. And what that means is it acts like a sponge and it can absorb moisture in the air. And if it gets wet and damp, it gets muddy and it won't be able to actually fire. So the more important thing than muskets were blankets. Blankets were very popular because for a First Nations person to want a blanket, even before the Hudson's Bay Company arrived, the local First Nations community, the Stalo in this area, they could make their own blankets for thousands of years. And their blankets would be similar to these ones. Now this is a replica style, but there's one problem. This is made out of wool. So back then they had no sheep. So for them to make their own blankets, they would have to get the wool from two different types of animals. Number one, mountain goat. Up in the Cascade Mountains, you would gather the hair that fell off the mountain goat or try to catch one, which would be almost impossible. Or, you see this picture close up? See if I can get away from the reflection there. This is one of the only confirmed photographs of a woolly dog. See that dog on the girl's lap? You would collect the hair from these dogs to make blankets. Now, if any of you have a pet dog at home, have you ever had to comb your dog? Have you ever had to gather all that hair from your dog? How much hair do you think you would need to make a big blanket like this one? Now imagine how much hair you would need to find back then if you're trying to make this out of mountain goat. How long do you think it would take then to make your own blanket? Don't forget, you still need to card it to clean it. You still need to spin it, dye it, and weave it together. So for a tribe of about maybe 80, maybe 100 people to make one blanket, it could take them as long as 5 years sometimes just to make one blanket. So if it took your family that long to make a blanket, do you want to be the one wearing it? I would think so. Because a blanket to a First Nations community was something that showed that you were a very important person. It was never really there to keep you warm. It was a status symbol, just like a top hat was for a man in England. Or you could come to Fort Langley and you could trade for your own. And if you look, they came in different colors. Just like a shopping center today, that's all Fort Langley was. So one of our buildings might have all the goods that came from Britain that our customers would want. Another building might be full of barrels. Barrels full of food. Like I've said earlier, Fort Langley, when we say it, was also a farm. 2,000 acres. That's 2 times the size of Stanley Park in Vancouver. So we'd see barrels full of food everywhere in the fort, but you'd always have a building full of it so we could sell food to different places. And then if you looked at the barrels, they could tell us a lot about it. This barrel here tells us, just from the label on it, 57 is the year it was packed. HBC is from the Hudson's Bay Company. FL, Fort Langley. And then there's an S on it, and that's telling us there's salmon inside this barrel. This would be full of 90 fillets of salted pickled salmon. It would weigh about 200 pounds. And in most of the places in the world, this barrel back then would be sold to Hawaii. But before it gets shipped off to Hawaii, you need a place to store it. So one of our storehouses would be full of barrels, full of salmon and other food, especially from our farm. Mainly potatoes, but other crops as well. And then finally, a third building would have all our fur. Now, because of the fact that the buildings are closed right now, we put away our fur and stored it in bins just to prevent squirrels from breaking into this building and trying to steal our fur, because sometimes that can happen. A lot of little squirrels and other rodents like to take the furs that are hanging here if no one's been in here for more than a month and try to make their own nests. So we put them away into bins so that doesn't happen. But I've got some photographs here of some of the animals that would be commonly brought in. So if people would be bringing in animals to trade, something like a lynx, a marten, think of it like a cousin of a mink. Mink are living in rivers and closer towards the ocean. Marten live higher up in the mountain areas. So if you ever went to places like Whistler, you might see marten up in the trees. These you might see in your own backyard today. Still commonly would be traded with the fort. This guy, one of my favorites, hard to find in BC, endangered animal now, the badger. Very common in England, but surprisingly, his fur was never used to make clothing. Of all the things in the world, most of the badger hair that was sent to England was actually used to make brushes for men's shaving cream. Go figure. One of the coolest animals that was traded with Fort Langley was a wolverine. And one of the special things about the fur of a wolverine is that if you look through a microscope and you cut the hair is hollow on the inside, which actually means in cold temperatures, the hair of a wolverine will never freeze. So this was actually the first fur that they used for the inside of mittens, and was also the first fur you would use on the inside of your hood on your parka. But the most important fur would be the beaver. And the beaver would be turned into these guys. I'm going to try to come down to this glass case here, see if you see them. These are actual beaver felt top hats. This one is over 100 years old. It's in a glass case. You probably hear the maintenance team outside mowing the lawn. Here, show you another one on this side. But if you were living in England, the price of a top hat back then would be just like the price probably of a watch today. Some watches could cost thousands of dollars. Other watches you might get for free in your Happy Meal at McDonald's. Same thing with top hats back then. It all depended on which company was making them and how fancy you wanted to be. Just like the t-shirt I'm wearing right now. It's a funny picture of Abraham Lincoln, but he was always known to wear a top hat. And the top hat he wore was called a stovepipe top hat, but it also got the name of Lincoln top hat because he, of most people, was the most famous person to wear those tall top hats as well. But that raw material to make those hats would be coming mostly from the Hudson's Bay Company if this was around the 1840s or 1850s. And this building was around then. And that's what makes Fort Langley a National Historic Site. It was because this building was still standing that the government of Canada decided to start to rebuild the rest of the fort to make Fort Langley a National Historic Site. And it actually officially opened as a historic site in 1958. And when it opened as a National Historic Site in 1958, this building was already 118 years old. Gives you a sense of how old this building is. So that's your little tour of the storehouse. Hopefully when the next phase starts up again, which we hope will be next month at some point, some of the buildings will be starting to open up. This one will open up as well, but you won't be able to walk through it like I did. We'll have some stanchions up so you'll be able to walk through, but you won't be able to go through the displays just like I did. But are there any questions?
Awesome. Thank you, Emmett. Lacey has a question. Lacey, what's your question?
Is the woolly dog still here or did it go extinct?
That's an excellent question. Surprisingly, the woolly dog is now extinct because once British Columbia became a colony, most people from around the world showed up, and that's when they started to introduce sheep to the area. And a lot of the people realized one sheep can probably produce a lot more wool than a small woolly dog. So they let the woolly dogs just run free. But the thing was, woolly dogs were used to living with people. They didn't know how to live on the wild themselves. So the woolly dog became extinct within the first 100 years. So there are no more woolly dogs. But if you want to think about what a woolly dog would have looked like, think of it like a little Jack Russell Terrier, but with real curly hair.
Interesting. So I have a question. So there, back in the day, they weren't using money to buy things. So that's why it was called a trading post, right? So can you give me an example of kind of how much something would cost. So like if someone wanted a blanket, what would they need to trade for? What was the value of the blanket?
That's a good question. We did have something like a currency back then, but it wasn't a dollar, it wasn't a pound, it was a Hudson's Bay Company's own type of money, and that was called a made beaver. So that was a full-grown beaver skin. Think of that like a dollar. So when you came to buy anything in the fort, it would all be priced in beaver skins. So you might ask, how much is this blanket? And then the clerk might tell you, oh, this blanket is worth 4 beaver. Or this blanket is worth as much as 16 beaver. That's one of the reasons why there's a symbol of a beaver on a nickel today, because beaver used to be money. So when you came into trade, you would bring in the beaver. That was think of it like our loonie. But that doesn't mean if you don't have beaver, you're out of luck. Anything else you bring into trade was like spare change. So 6 raccoon might equal a beaver. 4 black bear might equal a beaver. It doesn't even have to be fur. 50 salmon could equal 1 beaver. Bring me a canoe of cranberries. All those cranberries could equal a beaver. If you have gold, that can work too. And if you look around, nothing here actually had a price tag either. So it also depended on how well you got along with the clerks and the bosses of the fort. Is your daughter married to a man in the fort? Then you might get a friends and family discount. Are you a regular customer of Fort Langley? Then you might get some discounts. Did you bring a lot more to trade than anyone else that day? Then you might get a deal as well. Do you have something to give as a gift? So on and so forth. Lots of things would happen. So you could always barter. You could always negotiate and get a deal. Just like if you're playing trading cards with friends. You know, that's why it was a trading post, not a sales shop. There's a difference there.
Awesome. So also a question for you about, so what were the main items that were the most sought after? So what items at the fort were the First Nations people most wanting to get? And then the other way around, what items from local items were the people at the fort most wanting to get?
Well, what the First Nations wanted from us, based on the journals and the records that we see of Fort Langley, number 1 in terms of quality, what they wanted from us were the blankets. Number 2 would be metal tools, because we were the first place that you could get metal on a regular basis. But the biggest thing about the metal, like axe heads, was the fact that it wasn't just that you could get the metal. It's also the fact that we had a blacksmith that worked here. So you could get the metal from us, but then the blacksmith could change that metal into any shape you wanted. But the most common thing traded, the one that we traded the most, surprisingly, rope. And more often than not, probably to make fishing nets. So rope was traded more than anything else in terms of records. But the most desired thing, the most expensive thing our customers wanted were blankets. So a blanket, like I said earlier, could be as little as 4 beavers or 2 beaver skins. It could be as expensive as 16 beaver. 1 beaver could give you enough rope to make 2 fishing nets. 1 beaver could give you enough metal to make 2 axe heads. What we wanted from our customers, more often than not, was the fur. Beaver more than anything, because that's what the company desired back in England. The most expensive fur of them all was the hardest fur to find, and that was called the silver fox. And a silver fox has no red. is just black and white. So wherever the red should be on the fox is replaced with a dark brown or a black. And that's just a rare genetic trait, just like a spirit bear. So it was 1 in a million to find. So when you came to trade, 1 silver fox was actually worth 2 beaver. Aside from that, when it came time for the salmon runs in the summertime, salmon was very much desired because the fort needed the salmon to preserve ourselves, aside from just trading it, because we need food to survive over the winter as well. If we didn't have these relations with the First Nations, the men of Fort Langley would have never survived.
Awesome. So Declan has a question. I see your hand waving wildly, Declan. What's your question?
At the fort, did they ever sell spears?
Surprisingly, they never sold any other weapons aside from just the muskets that would have been available. So nothing seen in terms of spears, but axe heads were the most common metal tool that was traded for.
Did the desirable items change over time? Like what was wanted most? Did it change throughout the time that the fort was operating, or did it stay fairly consistent?
It stayed fairly consistent from what the fort wanted. What the customers wanted would have changed little bits over time. Primarily, though, the blankets were the go-getter. The color played a big factor, though. What the fort realized was we have to bring in different colors each year just to keep the demand high, just so people keep coming to shop. Same reason we go shopping to buy different shirts these days. Each year, there's a different shirt people want to wear, so the stores will start selling it. When the fort was first here, we started to just bring in the white with what we call the indigo stripe. And then the next year, we brought it in again. Both years, they sold very high. Then the third year, they didn't sell that high. Why? Because everyone already had that color. So then we had to come back the following year with just completely indigo. And then each year, we'd bring in a different color, a green one, then bring in a red one, then maybe bring in a blue one. The most popular one, red. Red was always seen as a symbol of power. The cheapest one, green. Because there were enough natural dyes outside for the First Nations people to dye the blankets green themselves. So they learned from their mistakes. When the fort was first built, remember that the Hudson's Bay Company was 150 years old. We thought the number one seller would be these muskets. Because who doesn't like guns? Everyone must like guns. And the first year, they sold very well because it was a brand new technology. Why not? Everyone would want this. The next year, our customers realized they had no use for this. They're fishermen. The weather's bad. They have no enemies. So the trade just started to go down. And that's why the boss of Fort Langley, a man named James Yale, said, you know what, guys? We have to stop how we're selling products to our customers. We can't keep bringing in brand new technology. We have to find out what's useful to our guests. So that's when he decided we're not going to bring in brand new technology anymore. We're going to bring in improved technology. We're going to look at what takes our customers the longest time for them to make themselves. And we're going to bring in the finished product, what's already made. So we know it takes them a long time to make blankets. We're going to bring in the blankets that are already made. We know it takes them a long time to make fishing nets out of probably cedar bark and twine from root of other plants. We're going to bring in rope that's already made. We know that they could probably make skinning knives out of wood, stone, or bone. We're going to bring in metal tools. So the main reason our customers were coming to shop here in Fort Langley wasn't because they needed any of this. The only reason they came to shop here is simply because it saved them time. Same reason we go shopping at the stores today. If you think about it, like this morning, I had cereal for breakfast. It was a lot easier for me to go get the milk from the refrigerator than by having a cow in my backyard. Right? If you put it into perspective, let's say Declan, I'll use you as an example. Let's say I'm in Declan's class, and after school, at the end of the school day, we've been given 100 math questions due the next morning. And on my way home, Declan says, "Hey, Ammon, I just got the new NHL video game. Do you want to come over and play?" Now, when I get home, I have two options. Option number one, I stay home and I do the 100 math questions myself. Option number two, I get my sister to do the math questions and I go play video games with Declan. What do you think I would do? I'd probably go with option number two. Do you think my sister's going to do my homework for free? Probably not. She'd probably say something like, give me $10. I'd say, $10? You're ridiculous. I'll give you a toonie. We have to negotiate. We settle on $5. I give her $5. I go play video games with Declan. Could I have done the math questions? Probably. We were taught how to do them in class. But do I want free time instead to do what I want? Yes, I do. It's the same reason our customers were coming to trade here in Fort Langley. It's not because they needed any of this stuff behind me. It's simply because it saved them time. And that's how Fort Langley operated. All we were was a shopping center. And we brought items that would save our customers time.
Awesome, Amin. Well, thank you so much for giving us a tour of the storehouse. It's nice to see some of the stuff that's there and learn a bit more about that. Lacey and Declan, do you guys have any questions before we end for today? No, you're good. Well, thank you so much. Next week will be our last Zoom meeting for the school year with Amin, but we're making plans for what we're going to do down there.